Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, and here they are. It's been a fun selection of books this week, some quite heavy themes going on in them, but I still think quite entertaining in their own ways as well. And this is outside of International Booker Prize reading, or there is a Women's Prize book in here as well, but for the most part outside of other prize reading, which is taking over quite a bit of other reading at the moment, but we shall see. But let's get talking a bit about these. First up, The Boyhood of Cain by Michael Amherst. And I really enjoyed this. I thought this was such an interesting book in many, many ways. So the core idea of it is a coming of age story, essentially, of a young boy who is at school where his father is the headmaster. And so at the beginning part of this book, Danny is this character who is really quite frustrated because he occupies this strange place in the school hierarchy, because everyone knows that his father is there, and is this, is the headmaster and all of this kind of thing. And so to some degree, people don't really feel like getting too close to him because that feels too tainted with other school things. But we also come to find out that he's also just a bit of an odd one out in other ways as well. And particularly when we start to see that his sort of growing sense of himself and his identity, and particularly being a young gay boy, essentially, or that seeming to be how his life is shaping out, means that he still occupies this odd one out place in the school hierarchy. He then becomes friends with somebody who comes to the school, and they seem to strike up this kind of friendship. But what then comes out from this is a wider thing of what happens when that changes fundamentally. So what happens when his father is no longer the headmaster and is somewhat of a pariah locally? What happens if everything else is a bit dodgy in terms of that, and other school things are happening that mean that his place and his sense of safety are also threatened. So I thought this book was really interesting for how it does this. It has a slightly detached tone almost. It's told in this very quiet, pensive way that I found really engaging. And I think it does so much that is so interesting. I really enjoyed this. I think it's really understated and it's really quiet, and I think I really appreciated that about this book. It points out those odd little bits of awkwardness that you have as a teenager, of there is something over here that you want to do, or something that you want to say but you don't quite know how to say it, or if you should say it, or if it's safe to say it. And particularly there's one scene in this book where Danny is being asked for a confession of some sort, and his inability to do that, I think, was so well handled in this book. Of actually, when you're that age, everything feels like it might sink the ship that you're on, that everything feels like it could have this huge impact, and so you choose the path of least resistance. And I think he's such an interesting character in this book, in a very pensive way that I think really gets inside his head for what it's like to be a teenager. Next up, from the Women's Prize shortlist, Good Girl by Aria, Aber. And I thought this was so interesting in several ways. It's quite a fascinating novel. It's largely about a young woman whose family are from Afghanistan, and she is in Berlin growing up and trying to reconcile the two worlds essentially around her, that she is that her family are relatively socially conservative. There are uncles and sort of various family members around, so occasionally she is caught up in that, with them saying that she's doing something wrong, or they saw her out in the street and she was wearing clothing that was too short, or whatever. And she's got this sort of Berlin lifestyle, and Berlin known for being slightly more in your face, like clubs and this sort of big nightlife, drugs, partying, all this kind of stuff, as well as this sort of alternative way of being. So her character, Neela, is caught in the middle of this, and that, sounds like a fairly standard novel in some ways, that trope has been explored in quite a lot of ways. But I think this book does something quite specific as well with that. So it, for example, examines her own sense of shame or kind of wanting to hide various aspects of her life. So she never really says to anyone until fairly late in that she is that she is Afghan, or at least that her family have come from Afghanistan. And she will repeatedly say that maybe she's Israeli or she's Greek or Cypriot or anything where the thing that makes her stand out might be tempered down in some ways. Because if she says that she's Greek, nobody really has questions about that. And she can also position herself as Christian, which helps in a setting in this book where, particularly where there's a rise in Islamophobia, where she is trying to position herself as being less threatening, essentially. Also in the midst of this, she has various relationships, and particularly one with an American man called Marlowe. And he is a writer, but also there's this strange dynamic where he is seemingly wanting to have multiple partners and is constantly pitting them against each other and various other things. And she is trying to navigate this both as a young woman, but also where there are other aspects of her identity that might make trouble for either side of this. So, you know, that her Afghan family might see something about this that's tricky and complicated and not like that she's around men, or might not like that she's having sex or taking drugs or whatever. But actually on the flip side as well, that other people around her might not necessarily have pinned her as that kind of person. And so she's constantly trying to second guess how everyone's going to see her. And particularly this comes to some interesting moments in the book. So, for example, there is a moment where some people around her are doing a fundraiser for dogs in Afghanistan, and they start talking about Afghanistan in this way of, oh, you know, this poor country, those poor women, talking about it in this really detached way of a sense of pity almost. And Neela is stood there with them thinking she's Greek, trying to work out how she's going to navigate that conversation. And I thought the book did really well at handling moments like that throughout as well. And it feels quite edgy as a book, but also like it's not trying overly to be edgy. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about it. Last but not least, I read The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he is a writer who I found absolutely fascinating whenever I've read things by him before. And he's done a bit of fiction, a bit of non-fiction. And I think The Message here is a really interesting book for the way it approaches various topics. So it's, for the most part, 3 bigger essays that are stitched together into this book. And there is some overlap, but to some degree they also operate really separately. And so one part of the book is him exploring particularly Senegal and thinking about African identities. And there is something for him about being this Black American man going to Africa for the first time. And in this first time for him being on that continent in a country where it is majority Black, he finds it so interesting that he doesn't really know how he fits into this. He's used to a US dynamic where there's sort of a much more multiracial society, and where he is in the sort of the structure and power minority within that. And so for him, he finds that sort of interesting that he is exploring both the history of Senegal, but also trying to work out where he slots into all of this as well. He then has another part of this book where he is exploring, essentially there's a setting where somebody is trying to ban his book in South Carolina, and he takes that as a moment to attend the talks about this, to kind of understand why his book is seen as so threatening to that, but also to understand what it looks like to be the person whose book is being banned and being in the room to hear those arguments. But he also goes into a much bigger conversation about what that looks like, why people think about banning books and all that kind of thing. And then finally, in this book, he explores quite a lot around Israel and Palestine, and he travels to Jerusalem and he explores that through multiple lenses, but particularly it in some ways sort of dovetails quite neatly with the part of him in Senegal, and he tries to draw a line between ideas of occupation and colonialism and race and difference and all of these other things through his lens as a Black American man, but looking at Israel and Palestine. And there's something so interesting about the way that this book stitches together, that he in some ways leaves some questions fairly open. He explores topics, he explores ideas, and then he comes to his own conclusions, but he also allows these to exist within a broader framework. He is not claiming to have all the answers on any of these things, but is more throwing up further questions. And I think that's what makes this book so interesting, is that he is, in some ways, us. We are him in this book of being the audience watching something happening and trying to understand what that looks like. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a really good week, and speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.